Hello and welcome to The Faceless Cook. Today we're going to be making Chelsea buns. Now a lot of people are scared of Chelsea buns because the method to make it requires a yeast risen dough. But hopefully today I will be able to show you that it's actually not that complicated and certainly is not something to be scared of. So, to make them, you will need 500 grams of white flour with 1 teaspoon of salt mixed into it. You will also need 7 grams of yeast. Now this is dried ordinary baker's yeast. You can also use 1 packet of ready to use right-in yeast. If you're even more unsure of this and you really want to make sure that this will rise, I would recommend that, but trust me, this works just fine. You will also need 1 egg, 40 grams of butter, 300 millilitres of milk, and mixed spice and cinnamon. Now this is only for the dough. There is a filling that goes within this and I will talk about that once we get to it. So, first stage. We have our flour and our salt mixed in here. What we want to do now is add in our yeast. Just using a spoon, stir it around. Now this differs an awful lot from other Chelsea bun recipes in that they recommend that you make a well in the centre, and when you add your liquids, which we shall do in a bit, you add it into that well as well. Now, if you're using that ready packet yeast, which is about 7 grams, that is perfectly fine to follow and you can do that. If you're using this one, however, it can clump and it can cause some worry, even though there's no need for worry. And if you're even more unsure, you can put the yeast into the milk and butter, which we're about to warm up on the hob until the butter's melted, and you can add the yeast into that to activate it if you so wish, but I assure you this will work. Alright, speaking of, we're now going to put our milk and butter into a pan on the hob and wait until it's melted. Our butter and milk have been warmed up, the butter has melted completely. Before we add this to our mixture, however, this is completely optional, but I like to add a little bit of the spices that we will use in the filling later on to the pastry, or the dough rather. This is simply to impart a little more flavour into it. So we'll add a little bit of cinnamon, not much, just about that much. I'd say that's roughly a teaspoon and a half, and a little less of mixed spice, I'd say half a teaspoon. Then we mix that in. We mix it in before adding the egg. So that's all nicely mixed together. Then we add our egg. And we add our butter and milk. Now this must be warm, but not too warm. You want it warm enough to help activate the yeast, but you don't want it to be too hot that it kills it off. So, you now mix this together until it is a dough. And once it is a dough, we will get on to kneading it. Now, as you can see, I've already started to use my hands. Well, my hand in this instance, because this isn't a heavy bowl. I would recommend using a heavy bowl if you have one. Sadly, this is all I have to hand. So I will need to hold on to this side for a bit. But basically, once it starts becoming a dough, here comes the most laborious part of it. You need to knead it for 10 minutes or so until it becomes elastic. 5 to 10 minutes really. You will know when it is because it sticks to your fingers less. At this point in time you can add more flour if you wish. You can also turn this onto a well-floured table, but it's easier and far less messy to simply knead it within the bowl situation. Now, kneading techniques, everyone has their own way of doing it. I personally just like to mess around with it as much as possible. You're basically trying to activate the gluten, which is the opposite of what we were trying to do with the shortbread last week. Thus ensuring that you have a springy dough that will bounce back a touch. This is what traditional kneading looks like, and it's a perfectly good method to use for this, or indeed for bread making. But personally, I like to simply stretch it around my hands like so, and generally mess around with it, until it reaches the stage where it's not sticking to your hands as much. As you can see, there was much less stuff sticking to my hands at this point in time. So, now that our dough is ready, we simply put it into the bowl, get as much of it off of our hands as possible, form it into a rough ball, and grabbing a tea towel, we cover it up and put it in a warm place to rise for an hour. Rising is simply when the yeast becomes active and starts creating air bubbles. Thus, in an hour, this should have doubled in size. If yours hasn't, it's likely that the area you've left it in hasn't been warm enough or has been too warm. And simply move it to a slightly cooler or warmer area and leave for another half hour. Okay, so it has been an hour now and it's had a chance to rise, so let's have a look at it. Yes, now as you can see, this has all but doubled in size. So now what we have to do is knock it back. This is, well, I don't actually know what it does, but it's necessary because we're going to be rolling it out. And don't worry, it will get another chance to rise in a bit. So that's sufficiently knocked back. Now we need to roll it. Okay, so as you can see, I put it on the table, and you may be confused as to why there's no flour. Now, my reasoning for this is very simple. I've run out of flour. I have instead oiled the table and the rolling pin. Now, it works perfectly fine, and I have done this before, but you have to bear in mind it will be slippery, and the table will be hard to clean at the end of it. But it will work just fine. So at this point, what we're aiming to do is make this into a large rectangle. As large as you want it to be, depending on how many we want to get out of this. You should be able to get at least 10 buns out of this. Just a heads up. Feel free to stretch it out like that and move it around as much as possible. Alright, as you can see, we have managed to get this out to a very large rectangle. We should be able to get more than 10 out of this. So, whilst I was waiting for the dough to rise, I prepared a mixture of brown sugar, about 75 grams, 2 to 3 4 cinnamon teaspoons, and 1 teaspoon of mixed spice. But basically you can do what you want. You can mix whatever you want. You need to have cinnamon in there, that is a predominant flavour, and you can also add ground ginger. Another thing you can do at this stage is add dried fruits, as is traditional within a Chelsea bun. However, 1, I do not have any, and 2, personally I prefer without. So, in this instance, we shall not have them. So, before you add that on, you must add about 25 grams of melted butter. There's an awful lot of fat and butter and sugar in this part of the recipe. Ideally, you should have a pastry brush to brush this around with at this point, but unfortunately I don't have one, so this spatula will work just fine. Alright, now this is buttered up, so we liberally sprinkle our mixture on. Technically speaking, you can use the same methodology to create cinnamon buns, which this basically is. It's a simplified version of it. And as you could probably notice, within the pastry itself, or the dough, there are little flecks of the yeast that you can see. That's perfectly normal. There is no need to panic over it. So you just scatter your cinnamon, your mixed spice, preferably your ground ginger as well, but once more I haven't got it sadly, and you just rub it over, and don't worry, my hands are incredibly clean. I made sure to clean them thoroughly. And then what you do, very simply, is roll it up as tightly as you can. The tighter you roll it, the neater it looks and the more impressive it looks as well. And this obviously creates the swirled effect. So, we'll just roll these up. Now that this is rolled up, you take a sharp knife and you simply cut it into roughly 1.5 to 2 centimetre thick little roundels. Now the size of this one, due to the thinness of it, will produce a very tightly packed but smaller bun. You can make these buns bigger, you can make them whatever size you want them to be. So we'll just cut these up now. Now, as you can see, I've put these onto a very lightly greased baking tray, and these now need to rise for 10 minutes. As you can see, I wasn't able to put all of them on there, but I will simply space these out so these two will have time to rise, and they will then be replaced on here when it comes to their time to be cooked. But these require 10 minutes because when you knocked back the dough to roll it out, you knocked the air out of it, and you want some of that air to come back into it so that you have a slightly fluffy texture to it. So, tea towel, and I'll get another one for that. 10 minutes, and in the meantime, you need to preheat your oven to 190 centigrade or 375 Fahrenheit or gas mark 5 for 10 minutes. These have had the chance to rise for 10 minutes. As you can see, they are slightly puffier. The ones that didn't fit onto this tray, and a few of the extras on here, I put onto another baking tray that I found. These will now go into the oven for 20 to 25 minutes, or until they're golden brown, or until you can stick a skewer all the way through one, and it comes out with no dough gooiness, but the sugar inside should have melted and amalgamated with the spices. So these will just go into the oven. So the buns are now baking in the oven, and as I said, they'll take 20 to 25 minutes. So we should get The buns are now baking away in the oven, and they will take some time. So whilst we're waiting for them to bake, we shall make the glaze, which is the final component of this. Now, it's basically condensed milk, and in theory, I suppose you can brush it with heated up condensed milk. I haven't done this. Personally, I wouldn't recommend it. I think this is slightly looser and slightly easier to glaze with. So, because I counted I have roughly 20 instead of 10 as I usually yield, no idea why, sometimes it's just the flour. I have roughly 100 millilitres of milk in this. I haven't precisely measured it, but you pretty much judge by eye how much you think you'll need. It's going to reduce a lot, so if you have 10, I would recommend about 3 tablespoons of milk with 2 tablespoons caster sugar. So I'm going to guess roughly 3 tablespoons caster sugar in that. And then you simply boil it on the hob, and then you let it simmer for 4 minutes. Then once the bun's out of the oven, we can finish off with the glazing process. Alright, and as you can see, these have now finished baking and are now waiting to cool, basically. But before they do cool, you need to get your glaze that you've made. It should look something like this, a slightly thicker texture, but still quite runny. And using a pastry brush or spoon, you simply splash a bit on every single. And as the bun cools, this will add the last little extra bit of sweetness to the pastry itself, because remember, that pastry is unsweetened. And it will simply just add another layer of taste to the finished bun. And here are our finished buns. Now, usually the glaze does set more opaque. I ran a little low in it, and so these ones weren't glazed quite so much. If you make more of the glaze, you will get the opaque, glistening look that you usually do get. Also, if you add fruit, they'll look more like traditional Chelsea buns. But to me, and having already tasted a little bit, I personally say I'm very happy with that. Best eaten with a lovely cup of tea at around 3:45 or whenever you want. Now, if you have a lot of them like I have here, you can keep them in a box like this for up to a week, I would say, before you really should throw them out. Or you can freeze them like this. They will defrost and freeze beautifully. So, I hope you've enjoyed this episode of The Faceless Cook, and I hope to see you again next week. Goodbye for now.